The date is September 26, 1983. Deep inside a secret Soviet bunker outside Moscow, the alarms began to scream. On a screen in front of Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov, a message appeared, the exact words he and every other officer in the room had spent years training for. The United States had launched a nuclear missile at the Soviet Union. As Stanislav watched in utter horror, more missiles showed up on the screen, until there were 5 in total, enough to kill millions of Russians if they were able to find their targets. After decades, the Cold War had turned hot, and Petrov knew what he was supposed to do. As duty officer, he was the one responsible for sending news of the launch up the chain of command, giving Soviet leadership a few precious minutes to retaliate before their own country was destroyed. As if by instinct, his hand reached for the phone. By 1983, the Cold War had been shaping global politics for nearly 40 years. The United States and the Soviet Union were not officially at war, but they were locked in what most people referred to as a permanent state of preparation. Both spent billions on missiles they hoped they would never use, while funding proxy wars around the world. They both told their citizens they stood for peace, but made it clear they would respond to any threat with total annihilation. They called this principle mutually assured destruction. If one side launched first, the other would launch back. Nobody could win, but they knew damned well that the entire world would lose. But in a twist of fate, this whole system depended on the belief that human beings would remain rational under the most extreme pressure imaginable. But cool heads were hard to find in the early 1980s. September 1983 is often remembered as one of the tensest times of the entire Cold War. Earlier that month, the Soviet Union shot down Korean Airlines Flight 007 after it entered Soviet airspace, killing 269 people, including an American congressman. To the United States, it was a brutal act of aggression. To the Soviet leadership, the aircraft's presence near sensitive military territory raised real fears of espionage. Regardless of differing opinions, nobody could argue that the event had made the relationship between the two nuclear superpowers even more volatile. This wasn't helped much by rhetoric coming out of Washington, D.C. President Ronald Reagan had intensified his verbal attacks against the Soviet Union, which he called the evil empire.
Let us be aware that while they preach the supremacy of the state, declare its omnipotence over individual man, and predict its eventual domination of all peoples on the earth, they are the focus of evil in the modern world.
The positioning struck directly at Russian fears that the United States was preparing for confrontation. Operating under severely heightened paranoia, Soviet intelligence agencies began looking for signs that America might launch a surprise first strike. Automation may have been in its infancy, but each side knew it could be the best chance to get one over on the other. In a nuclear scenario, every second mattered, so the US and USSR both developed their own early warning systems. The Soviet model was a satellite warning system called OKO. Its job was to observe the United States from space and detect any possible launch of intercontinental ballistic missiles. The theory went like this: the satellite would be able to see the flash of the launch, while the attached computer would process the signal to ensure accuracy. Once confirmed, it would alert a human operator who would take it from there. But there was a problem. The system was new and far from what you might call foolproof. Because it was focused on detecting infrared heat signatures, it could potentially be tricked by certain atmospheric conditions, reflections, and unusual patterns of sunlight. That didn't stop the Soviets from putting it into service anyway. Had they staffed it with scientists, things might have been okay. But instead, they used military personnel. These men were not trained to evaluate information. They are trained to obey. Petrov was, by all accounts, a very good soldier and a proud Soviet. He'd been born on September 7, 1939, near the city of Vladivostok. His father, Yevgraf, had been a fighter pilot during World War II, while his mother had been a nurse. Service was in his blood, so when he was old enough, he enrolled in the Kyiv Military Aviation Engineering Academy. Upon graduation, he joined the air defense and was assigned to the brand new early warning system. One of the things that separated him from the thousands of other young men in the military was that he had a background in radio engineering. Because of that, he understood that technology could fail. He had seen computers seem certain before, even when they were wrong. That knowledge would soon become more important than rank, protocol, or ideology. Because just after midnight, inside Serpukhov 15, the alarms went off, and the computer screen clearly showed 5 missiles heading for Soviet airspace. In that moment, everything was demanding action: his fellow soldiers, protocol, and the system itself. If Petrov reported the warning as real, Soviet leadership would have only minutes to respond. And in the logic of the Cold War, response meant retaliation. But that's when he did something truly remarkable. He asked himself a question. Why would the United States start a nuclear war with only 5 missiles? A real first strike would likely be overwhelming, consisting of hundreds of warheads. The US was well aware of the tenets of mutually assured destruction. It would only make sense to try to disable Soviet command before retaliation could begin. You can't win a war like this with 5 missiles. That's when he noticed a second strange fact. The secondary warning systems were silent. The military had ground-based radar spread out around the world. If there were missiles incoming, why weren't they detecting them? Petrov was sitting in a bunker, under pressure, with the weight of millions of lives pressing down on him. He knew very well that if he ignored a real attack, Soviet citizens could die without warning. However, if he reported a false one, he would begin a nuclear exchange that would kill people across the world. There was no perfect choice. In fact, there was only one risk. He would later report being utterly terrified by the situation, describing the other officers as simply staring at him while the alarms blared in their ears. Then, he picked up the phone and reported the warning to his superiors as a false alarm. After that, all he could do was wait, because if he was wrong and Oko was right, missiles would impact Soviet soil in a matter of minutes. Yet nothing happened. He'd been right. More importantly, he'd averted nuclear annihilation by trusting his gut at a time when he was supposed to do anything but that. Later investigations found that sunlight reflecting off high-altitude clouds had confused the satellite system, nearly ending the world in the process. You might expect Petrov to have been celebrated immediately. After all, if his judgment prevented a nuclear war, he had performed one of the most consequential acts of restraint in human history. But that is not what happened. For years, almost nobody knew his name. Soviet authorities reportedly buried the incident because acknowledging it would mean admitting that their warning system had failed. More importantly, praising Petrov would mean admitting that good things could come from military personnel questioning orders. The system had demanded obedience. Petrov had disobeyed. And he had been right. Institutions rarely like stories like that. Rather than being rewarded with glory, Petrov was criticized for procedural mistakes, including how he recorded the incident afterward. Eventually, he left the military altogether. Ironically, he was hired at the same research institute that had developed the Oko early warning system, but he later retired to care for his wife after she was diagnosed with cancer. He lived outside Moscow until he died in 2017. His heroic story would remain mostly unknown until the fall of the Soviet Union. The disturbing part of Petrov's story is not simply that a machine failed. That happens all the time, even today. What is most upsetting is that the Cold War led to a civilization organized in such a way that such a failure could become a global catastrophe. Cold War nuclear doctrine depended on speed, certainty, and the idea that hesitation was weakness. But on that night, hesitation saved countless lives. And in the new AI world, Petrov's story exposes something uncomfortable. We often treat technology as if it removes human error. But technology is built by humans, interpreted by humans, and trusted by humans. It isn't flawless. It just carries flaws at machine speed. Most people woke up the morning of September 27, 1983, completely unaware that the continuation of human history had depended on one man doing the most human thing possible: hesitation.